Welcome back from lunch, everyone, and the cool will stop us from the after lunch sleepy slide. All right. Welcome to the panel of Anne Wales. Anne is behind a pillar. Hello, Anne. And Karen Ritchie and Sarah Morton will be coming up. We're not going to do the chairs yet because we do want to see the presentations, but we're here talking about impact. And I'm just going to give a couple of slides around impact. This is actually a good time because you're going to be talking, you've got an impact, I'm pointing at you, you know, because you're going to do an impact. So at that table is going to be an impact session. There's an impact action learning format tomorrow. So there's a lot about impact, but today we're going to be talking about these frameworks for impact. So there's the Paris framework, promoting action, research, and implementation in health sciences. There's a consolidated framework for implementation research. Raise your hands if you've heard of any of these. The community impacts of research-oriented partnerships, the CROP. No? Any Canadian will know what this is, right, Monica? The knowledge to action cycle. Where does it start? Or where does it end? And while there's an evaluation box, if it doesn't really have a start and an ending, you know, where do you evaluate that? I'm not even going to spend any time describing this one from Alex Bennett. Are you here? Good. It has a cone of possibilities on the right. Whatever. This one's actually quite neat because while it's shaped a little odd, it actually does start with conducting research, and then you share your findings where you disseminate the knowledge, although to me that's kind of the same thing, and you get short-term, long-term impact. So that's actually kind of an okay one. That's just got a lot of colors. This is one I did, actually. But so where you start with research, you disseminate, there's uptake, implementation. The impact comes out of the space of your partners. This is Alberta Innovates Health Solutions, really robust evaluation framework. But again, you can sort of see that at the bottom, it starts with doing stuff that has outputs, that is adopted and get final outcomes. So, you know, we're kind of be talking about that. But does this make you crazy? It should. So, because what I try and do is talk about the KISS factor, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Morton. Not that your framework, Sarah, is simple, but I think it's an approachable framework. And what you have on your tables is actually Sarah's going to tell you what you have on the tables, right? So Sarah Morton is from the University of Edinburgh, the Centre for Research on Families and Relationships.
Hi, excuse me. So, I'm from the Centre for Research on Families and Relationships. I have some other roles around knowledge to action, including What Works Scotland and some other roles. And I became interested and I developed a framework to look at and explore the idea of research impact, partly because I was interested really in reflecting on my own practice. And then over time, I've used this framework. It's the basis of a 4-star ref impact case study. I've just recently used it with some genomics investments with the ESRC. The one on your table is an example of using it to assess the impact of participatory research. And I've been using it with my two fellow panelists, Anne and Karen here. And so what I want to do in this incredibly short session, like we could spend about 2 hours talking about this sort of stuff, I'm sure, is very quickly go through what we mean by research impact and then how this framework tries to address some of the problems that we have with trying to assess research impact. But kind of the starting point, I think, for any work in this area, and maybe that's one of the problems with those ones you just showed, David, is what are we trying to do? So why do we want to assess impact? And for a lot of us in this room, it's about showing that knowledge mobilization work actually does something that has some effect. And it might also be to learn about the effectiveness of different kinds of strategies that we might have around knowledge mobilization. But people are also assessing impact to report to funders on what they've achieved in various sorts of ways. And of course, recently, for those of you who are from the UK, if you've got anything to do with the university, you will know that we're now demonstrating research impact as part of a government accountability exercise called the Research Excellence Framework. So we need to start out with a sense of what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And certainly my interest was really about learning about knowledge mobilization. How can we be in this evidence-based world where we want people to understand evidence and then not look at evidence for what we're doing, how effective what we are doing is? So if we try and think about what we mean by research impact, The definition that's mainly used in the UK is this massively broad, our research achieves impact, the demonstrable contribution, note the word demonstrable, to society and the economy made by knowledge and skilled people. And there are some further definitions. How many of you are familiar with the REF definitions? Who's been working on that recently? Yeah, okay. There are some further definitions, but they're incredibly broad. Personally, it's kind of trying to be all-encompassing rather than give us any sort of guidance. So my preferred way of starting to think about this is from Sandra Nutley and colleagues, and Sandra's here today, which is trying to really think about what do we mean about research use, and to think about it along a spectrum from conceptual to more instrumental uses. And this framework really influenced my choice of using contribution analysis as a way of assessing impact, because the categories along here are reflected quite strongly in contribution analysis. So for my own work, I then wanted to do some more definition around what we mean by using research. And for the purposes of trying to get your handle around impact assessment, I came up with this quite simple thing that people tend to like, which is trying to get people to think beyond research uptake. So those of you working with academics will know, they say, oh yes, but I gave evidence at a government committee, and oh, I had 100 people at my conference, oh, I was in the press, all of those kinds of things, oh, I've had impact. So to try and get people to think about those kinds of activities as research uptake, so you've got some interest. People have come along, they're talking about it, reading it, or listening to you, but it's really then what our stakeholders, what research use stakeholders do, that creates something that might be a contribution to change. And there's some really massive challenges in assessing impact in this area. So we need to think about what types of impact we want to look at. Do we want to look at those hard policy or practice impacts, or do we want to look more around raising awareness or changing people's skills? We have some real issues around timing. So research impact tends to happen over a very, very long time frame. And obviously, as that time goes on, the ability to trace it back to any research becomes more and more difficult. There's a kind of black hole really around that. We know that context really matters, and everyone goes, oh yes, context, very, very important, but we haven't got very good tools for assessing it or thinking about it. And then do we actually need to track actual impacts and show they happened? Or can we say, look, we've done the right things in order that this could achieve impact. Should that be enough, the potential impact? And then we have to deal with these difficult questions around attribution and additionality. So how do we know that research made a difference, and what difference did it make? And then also we're trying to get away from linear models of research use and impact, but also still link activities to outcomes, and those things are really in contradiction. So we've got to tell a good story about how research achieved impact, but we've got to acknowledge it doesn't necessarily happen in a linear way. So I'm just going to skip the next slide, actually. These are the kind of very well-documented main methods, which I'm not going to talk about just at the moment, but I got interested in using contribution analysis. There's a bit of serendipity involved, which I'll tell anyone about over a coffee. But I was really interested because it was a very clear way of linking activities to wide outcomes. And it had this resonance with that research use spectrum that I put up earlier. But for me, particularly, it can be used for a planning and evaluating tool as you go along, or to look back on something that you've done. And for someone as a knowledge exchange practitioner, I wanted something that I could really use. It wasn't seen as a sort of separate external evaluation, although you can use it in that way. You can use it in a much more integrated way. And the other thing that was really appealing to me was it really focused on stakeholder engagement and what they do next. So it really scrutinized the process of who do you engage, how do you know they're the right people, what do they think, do they have the capacity to do things differently? All of these questions that we know are key to understanding impact and research uptake. And the other thing that this approach does is recognize that there are other influences in the system. So rather than saying, okay, well, we'll do this and then that will happen, we know, who was talking about viral impact? Was it? Yeah. We know that sometimes the context is conducive and things get swept up really quickly. Other times they don't. So how do we understand those other influences in the system? Right, faster. Okay, so I don't think I can really talk about that one, so I'm just going to, which is a shame. Anyway, so it's basically trying to create a map through different spheres of influence and trying to create a map through the complex world that we need to do to say something about impact. And as we move out from what we do to impact or change, the external factors become more and more more and more strong. So what my framework tries to do, this framework based on contribution analysis, is create this map. So now it starts to look really linear, so you have to bear this diagram in mind as we take our little slice of this world out to assess impact. So the basic approach is like this. You'll see the ideas of uptake, use, and impact are along the side there. And so if you think about it in research terms, we start off with input, so we're interested in some sort of problem. We had some sort of expertise in this problem. We researched it maybe, or maybe it was just knowledge mobilization activities. We carried out certain sorts of activities with certain sorts of key stakeholders. We think about how they were engaged and involved. Interestingly, we think about what their reaction was to what we were offering them, how it fitted with what their kind of current knowledge. We think about the implications for them and their capacity to do something differently, and then we look at what they did differently and how it might have contributed to change. And then just to quickly go through those categories, so we think about some of the things we might measure. So in terms of outputs and activities, we want to show that we've got research and knowledge exchange activities. We want to show how we've targeted specific research users and the success of our engagement with them. And moving along, we need to think about changes in awareness and what we can observe in terms of how aware they are of the issues raised. We need to look at what the changes are in knowledge and skills. What's the learning that's going to underpin them doing something differently? And then we can start to look at the ways in which they have done something differently. And then finally trying to usually extract that logically to sort of final outcomes and impact. So basically this process involves setting out a results chain of what you think is going to happen. And if you look in the briefing, you'll see there's an example there with the participatory research. So if you were going to plan that process, what would it look like? And then you go through a process of assessing risks and assumptions, which I haven't got time to describe, but it's quite fundamental in terms of taking into account the context. And identify some appropriate measures. What I like about this approach as well, it invites you to assemble existing data. So what monitoring data do you have in your system? What does the research base say about effectiveness? And then what feedback do you already have? And how do you then shore that up by identifying gaps and collecting more evidence? And the other thing is you can adapt and review and analyze it as you go. The idea isn't you set it in stone and then you measure yourself against something that's fixed. If you go and try and engage teachers and you only manage to engage social workers, then rather than plowing on ahead and going, oh, we didn't have an impact on education, you actually stop and go, right, they're not the right people, we need to now rethink it. Or if you suddenly get an opportunity to go and talk to the Prime Minister about it, rather than excluding that, you tie that into your model. So it allows for the sort of serendipity that happens with knowledge mobilization, but it also makes you work harder at the core parts you need to get right. So it's a method of evaluation which allows you to analyze process and outcomes, and it acknowledges that there's lots of things that are influencing change. And particularly with research, it's usually only one. Unless you're inventing a cure to cancer, then it is only one thing that's going to influence change. And then it provides a way of demonstrating that you've reached these outcomes. It's great for planning knowledge exchange. It's a great basis for partnership discussion, because you get everyone around the table going, okay, how are we going to achieve impact? Well, we think we should do this. Someone else says, oh, we need to do that. So you can have a really good discussion about how you're going to get to those final outcomes. And it's quite adaptable to different time frames, although that's another whole kind of conversation. So you could think about assessing immediate outcomes and then how that might lead to longer term change, or you could follow it for a longer period of time.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. We've got in order, I'm going to invite Karen Ritchie from Healthcare Improvement Scotland to come up, and then Anne Wales from NHS Education for Scotland, because both of them have worked with Sarah, and both of them have practiced this framework within their context. So I'm going to ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes, and then we're going to come to a panel. We're going to have a bit of panel reflection back to Sarah, because it's her framework. As Sarah said, there is a briefing note on each of the tables. You can take a look at this. And if we have time, we're going to ask you to do a little bit of work as well. So, Karen, could I ask you to come up? I think your slides are there. Oh, you're not using slides.
I'm not using any slides. I do need to put my glasses on now. So, yes, I haven't got any slides. I thought I'd make it more informal by not using slides, but since I've forgotten to bring my poster with me, it just makes me look sloppy now, doesn't it? Anyway, we've worked with Sarah for a wee while now, and we were looking at a way of evaluating not just our specific knowledge mobilisation work, but our wider quality improvement work in healthcare. And three things came together. I spoke with the folk in Health Scotland who do health improvement work. We were working with Sarah on specifically around the knowledge interaction work, and I went to an IHI forum where there was discussion of how to evaluate quality improvement work in healthcare, and they were all essentially using the same thing. And so that was good. We thought we can run with this. So I'm going to give you two examples, and I'll probably have to speak very quickly because I'll get the flag otherwise. But the first one was our CLEAR service, and our CLEAR service is a clinical inquiry service. So practitioners across the healthcare in Scotland can submit requests to the CLEAR service, and it's a coordinated service where information scientists respond to these requests for the evidence base. So it's not research as in primary research that we're mobilising here, it's secondary research. So it's research that's already been done, synthesised through systematic reviews, etc., and made into good quality evidence of what the model of care should look like. So we developed an outcomes chain, and Suzanne Wilson, who's in the room, did most of this work, developed the outcomes chain, looking at what the activities would be, that is producing the clear summaries for the practitioners, what the reach would be, and we were primarily going for primary care staff and staff within remote and rural areas that didn't have access to library staff and librarian services. But it was available to all NHS practitioners. And then going down the chain, our short-term outcomes were things like the reaction. Did people find this a useful thing to ask? Was it user-friendly in terms of submitting the requests and getting the responses back? Was it timely in terms of their decision-making, that immediate reaction? Then up the chain is did their knowledge and skills, their attitudes and aspirations change? Did they feel they were better informed through the process? Did they know about the wider facilities that we have? We have marvellous facilities in the NHS in Scotland in terms of access to knowledge through the Knowledge Network. Did they engage with that and understand how librarians and knowledge services staff could support them? And then, of course, further up the chain, there's practice behaviour. Did it change in terms of their clinical decision-making? And ultimately, at the end of the chain was there improvement in patient care? But of course, it's really hard to measure that from an inquiry that somebody has made around whether they should give vitamins to a premature infant or whatever it was. So it wasn't used as a planning tool, but we could see how it could be used as a planning tool because the service was already in place. And it wasn't developed over a long period of time, but it was effective. A lot of the data required to measure these different aspects of the chain was being collected as we went along, so it was easy to use. It wasn't difficult to gather the other information. We did it through telephone interviews and a feedback mechanism that was built into the system. So we believe that the evaluation chain has worked really well for CLEAR. It was a very defined project and it worked very well. However, we also used it for another project, and again, this was about knowledge mobilisation, but it was very specific in that it was about staff in care homes using a resource pack of best practice and tools and techniques. And the aim was to reduce the incidence of falls amongst the residents in the care home by 50% in 9 months. So not pretty steep target there. And what was happening was the project was being developed. The approach and the activities as part of that project were being developed while the project was being run. So there was no time for planning. There was very little time for building the outcomes chain. And measuring additional information on top of what was required for the project itself was very challenging. So it wasn't really, although a chain was built, it wasn't used in any real sense to gather data and measure outcomes against the use of this resource in the project. And it was really a timing issue, I think, that was the tricky bit. So we found it a useful mechanism for identifying what changes might happen in a chain, because obviously putting in a program of learning sets and teaching people about plan, do, study, act cycles, etc., doesn't then immediately translate into reducing falls by 50%. So it was useful in helping think through what the changes might happen across time that might lead to that reduction in falls and improved patient outcomes. But in terms of gathering and demonstrating those changes, it was very challenging in a short-term project. So these are two similar sorts of programs, and one we feel it's been relatively successful, probably because it was clear and defined and it's been going for a long time, and the other one because the project was less well defined to begin with and was being run over a very short period of time. So I'll just conclude by saying that we're using this approach for very many of our projects now in the organisation for broader quality improvement projects. And we find it useful because people get it. They understand the spheres of influence issue that you can only, providing a response to a clinical inquiry, you are not changing practice for the individuals. That requires a practitioner between the respondent to the inquiry and the patient themselves. So that spheres of influence is very well understood. But it is challenging to build the mechanisms to gather the additional information and then write up the story in a way that's meaningful for all of those that are participating. So I think that's all I need to say. Thank you.
And Anne Wales from the NHS Education for Scotland will provide the second case study of contribution analysis, and then we're going to come into a panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to say a little bit about our work in implementing the knowledge into action strategies for health and social care in Scotland, and what we've learned about using the outcomes chain and contribution analysis approach that Sarah was describing. We have two strategies for knowledge mobilisation in health and social care in Scotland, but they came together to define a shared vision, which you can see articulated there, about developing a national network of learning technology, content and people, which would help practitioners and policymakers to embed knowledge in practice and policy. Our knowledge into action model is based on some of the frameworks that you heard David describe as sort of overview and distilling out of what we felt was most practical and pertinent from those frameworks, and also based on a review of the evidence around approaches that can work in translating knowledge into practice. It's been through a number of iterations, but as you can see, essentially it's a virtuous cycle, starting by identifying stakeholder needs for knowledge into action support, sourcing the knowledge, evaluating it, converting it where appropriate into actionable formats that are easier to use in decision making, and accompanying that by knowledge exchange and implementation, facilitation, for example, through communities of practice and planned implementation approaches. And you can see knitted into our cycle in the top left-hand corner is research and evaluation as part of the process that builds up our evidence base for what works in knowledge into action. It is a practical operational model, not just a conceptual model, and you can see at the centre of it we have this growing network of knowledge brokers drawing upon our librarians in healthcare and upon a number of other types of knowledge manager that can offer support at some or all stages of this cycle to staff in health and social care. And you also see in the middle of it, we have a real focus on building self-sufficiency within the workforce in sourcing, sharing, and evaluating knowledge for themselves. Knowledge into Action has a whole implementation programme associated with it. Sitting within that programme, there's multiple individual projects that are grouped under 3 strands. The overarching strand is about applying these knowledge into action approaches that are set out in the cycle to contribute to important health and care priorities. And that's enabled by 2 underpinning strands that are about developing the technology and the skills of knowledge brokers to offer the necessary support. I highlighted that evaluation of impact was built into our cycle, and this is the point at which we made contact with Sarah and learned about the outcomes chain approach that she's been describing and the way that that could help us define the relationship between our outputs from the programme, our new technology products and our new knowledge broker skills, and the kind of influence that we have directly in terms of reaching practitioners and managers, getting them involved in actually accessing our tools and support, and beyond that having a somewhat greater impact in terms of their capabilities, their knowledge and skills. And then the outermost sphere is where we have the most important but also the most challenging type of influence, indirect influence very often on changing practice and decisions and ultimately contributing to better health and care outcomes. And of course, as you move up the levels of the chain, our ability to directly influence these types of impact reduces, and the competing external factors in the local environment, culture, policy change become all the stronger. However, we found this approach, despite the fact that, as has been highlighted, it's presented linearly, and we know experience is not exactly linear. Nonetheless, we found it a really useful tool to help us break down the different types of impact that we might expect to have, and to build up an argument about the kind of causal relationship between these levels of impact. So this shows our overarching outcomes chain for knowledge into action as a whole. You can see it's basically just turning that series of ovals on its head and presenting the levels of impact vertically. But it immediately highlights to us that all our effort down at the bottom of the chain and all the products that we create are only the start of the story, and that we need to invest our efforts in pushing the impact higher and higher up the chain. Since we started implementation back in 2013, we've applied this evaluation approach to quite a number of projects. One of the earliest ones where we're still continuing to evaluate impact is around the Knowledge into Action support package that we offered to the Sepsis Collaborative. So it's a great example of knowledge brokers across health boards coming together to source evidence to support that collaborative. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner the way that we presented the evidence bundle linked to evidence sources, converted that evidence into an actionable tool in the form of a mobile app for calculating the early warning scores for sepsis. And we also supported the social exchange of knowledge within the collaborative through a virtual and personal community of practice. So that was our package of outputs. We used the outcomes chain then to identify the different types of measures that we could take at the different levels of the chain. So in terms of reach, we were able to calculate the number of times our sepsis app had been downloaded. We were able to identify the number of members of our community of practice. So a nice quantitative measure there. In terms of reaction, questionnaire and interview told us how practitioners found using the app and belonging to the community of practice. Again, 86% positive response there, so very encouraging. Interestingly, we found that the app and the community of practice are having an impact on knowledge and skills particularly among some of the junior medical staff who are reporting that the app increases their awareness of how to diagnose and manage sepsis. And something we weren't expecting was that the app was really being used as an educational tool as well as a point-of-care decision support tool. And then at the higher level of the chain, in terms of impact on practice and decisions, here it was good to see that in our survey, we had over 75% saying that they believe the app in particular has made a contribution to safer care in sepsis, and a 64% saying that they believed it would make a contribution in future. And you can see right up at the very top of that chain is the overall outcome and impact that the Sepsis Collaborative as a whole is having on delivery of safer and more effective care in sepsis. And using the outcomes chain allows us to tell the story about how our knowledge into action support is feeding into that overall outcome for patient care. We've applied the approach to quite a number of other projects. You can see a few listed here. Karen's already mentioned the clinical inquiry and response service, but we've also used it to measure impact of our communities of practice, our knowledge broker network, a package of support in Greater Glasgow for person-centred care, and a delivery of guidance and evidence through mobile apps for junior doctors and out-of-hours care. Several of these are described in the posters at this conference. You can see from my summary of key types of outcome on the right that in many cases the outcomes we're able to measure just now are change in knowledge and skills, change in relationships, particularly between our librarians and other knowledge brokers and practitioners, new and closer working relationships, but also some genuine reports of where that knowledge into action support has made a change to decisions about care. So our experience in using this evaluation approach, many strengths. As Karen has said, people do quite quickly understand the logic of the outcomes chain. Defining indicators, particularly at the lower levels, has been fairly straightforward, and we have been able to do it quite largely as part of just our day-to-day operational resource without calling in a great deal of extra evaluation expertise. It's flexible, seen it, heard about it applied to many approaches, creates opportunities to bring stakeholders together in planning and evaluation. And also it has this comfort that we're doing something we think is achievable. We're looking at contribution of our knowledge into action efforts rather than being kind of shoehorned into trying to show that outcomes are wholly attributable to our work. So it reflects reality in a way that people feel comfortable with. Challenges. I mentioned that our implementation program is a program that incorporates multiple projects. So we're still grappling with how we tell the story at that overarching program level, as well as at the level of individual projects. The evaluation matrix did seem a little daunting at the beginning, but generally people have got to grips with it. There is a real tendency we found for some confusion in the people we speak to about exactly what we're evaluating, and we need to be really clear we're evaluating the impact of our knowledge into action support, not the impact of their whole improvement programme. And of course, because the two are so closely related, it can be quite challenging to tease those apart. Indicators are harder to define at the higher levels of the chain, and of course there is a cyclical effect. As we see knowledge and skills increase, so also the reach and the reactions are likely to improve as a consequence of that greater capability in the system. I think the final point that the jury is still out on is we have a little family, a portfolio of contribution stories building up now. They tell stories about impact that we believe in, but we still have to put them to the test in terms of, will our executive teams be convinced enough by hearing about contribution rather than attribution, and by hearing about stories rather than lots of graphs and figures that they can point to. So that's been our little overview of our experience, and I know you're keen to have some discussion now.
So I'm going to invite Karen and Anne to have a quick conversation with Sarah. I get the throne. I just want to make that clear. All right, thank you. You've got 2 mics right there. And start out with Karen. Is there one thing, if you could ask Sarah to have done one thing before she started this engagement with you, what would that be? Like, looking back on your relationship now, what would you have liked to have known at the beginning? Oh, sorry.
I guess one of the things at the beginning was about how much time to invest in the planning and development process and what that would look like. In the various projects we've applied it to, we haven't used it we've tried in some instances to use it in the participatory fashion that I know Health Scotland use it in, and I think you use it in for many of your projects, rather than 1 or 2 people in the back room putting it together. But that's often because of the timing and what we're asking from our stakeholders already, that's quite challenging. So I guess it's something about that resourcing of the process that might have been helpful, but then again, it might have put us off completely.
Sarah, you've seen this implemented in a number of cases. What's the sort of time frame that Karen was just talking about that people really need to do a good job in both the planning and then the analysis?
I think it's hard to just put it in a time frame because it's a kind of combination of time and resources. And I think there's some bigger issues percolating around this because the tide, certainly in Scotland, is flowing much more towards self-evaluation and away from external evaluation. It's partly because of cuts, and it's partly because everyone's on this sort of journey to do everything better with less money usually. Anyway, but I think there's a load of tensions in that, and actually we've found that with a couple of things we've been doing together. So people initially go, oh yes, sure, we can do this ourselves, and they get very enthused with the process, but then they just get back on with the job, and then it's not really embedded in the way they do things. So then you bring in some more resource, and rather than that helping them to do it, they take their foot off the pedal even more and go, oh, the evaluators are back in. You know, we don't need to do it. So I think there's a whole lot of issues around the sort of mindset of embedding evaluation in what you do rather than expecting someone else to come in and do it for you that we've really been working around, and I don't think any of us have solved it. So in all of the places where I've done this, bar one, where I've been supporting people to do their own evaluation as opposed to me running an evaluation team, there's been this kind of coming and going, apart from one where a member of staff was given a dedicated role for the duration of the project to hold the evaluation brief. And she phoned me up if she needed help, and I helped her with some things, but she very much held the brief, and it was a tiny organisation with 3 people, so that might have helped.
And Anne, reflecting on you came in with a robust model, your knowledge to action model, and you had embedded knowledge brokers. Reflecting on how you had that, and then you were having an interface with the contribution analysis. How did that work with your established frameworks, and then Sarah coming in and supporting?
Thank you. Well, in fact, the two were pretty much concurrent. The work in putting together our knowledge into action model only slightly preceded bringing Sarah and colleagues from Health Scotland in to define the evaluation approach. The model that I showed on the screen just now has evolved over the years as we've been implementing knowledge into action. So in fact, it started off looking rather more linear, in fact, and more broken up. And I would certainly say that the experience of evaluation and that rigour, I suppose, of thinking about the importance of evaluation in our work, has contributed to the way the model now looks, which is much more of a cycle and with evaluation built in. So I think the model development and the evaluation development did work in synergy fairly well.
Sarah, is it easier to support contribution analysis in an organization that has established models and structures, or in one that's fairly greenfield?
It's basically easier to do the more tightly defined what you're trying to evaluate is, and the smaller it is. And it's harder to do the less well defined, and also as you go up complexity, so the more complex, the more wide-ranging. So with Karen, we've been working on the collaboratives, which are these overarching health collaboratives, and then you've got to try and find some ways that you drill down, because you can't evaluate the thing as a whole. You have to have some layers, where if you go in for a specific project, like the CLEAR example, the boundaries are very tidy, and so it's much, much easier to do. Did I answer your question?
No, that's great. I'm going to take about 5 minutes of audience Q&A. I'll come to you with the mic. And then I'm going to ask for 5 minutes. You do some table conversations, and we report back in for 5. Is that okay with you guys? Okay, anyone got questions?
But we only have 4 minutes.
Oh, well, that's right. We're only going to 2:45, not 3. There you go. I defaulted to an hour. So we're not going to do your table work. We're going to go straight into questions. Yes. So there's a hand up here. Sandra.
It's a question for all three of you, but maybe more importantly for Sarah. One of the questions I get asked is, would you use a different method if you're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular intervention, i.e., does this sort of guideline development process work in mobilizing knowledge, or does this sort of knowledge broker work, as opposed to providing a story, an impact story? So is your contribution analysis, is it more geared towards providing the impact story, or is it equally suited to evaluating the effectiveness of a particular knowledge mobilization practice or strategy?
I mean, I think it's really flexible. As long as you set it up in that way differently, you could do either with it. And I suppose it would depend partly on what sort of levels of outcomes you were interested in with your intervention. So if you're interested in how well does it work, the kind of questions about for whom and to what extent would have to frame how you would set it up. Whereas if you were doing the other way, those questions maybe would be more immediately answered. But I think it's really pretty flexible, as long as at the beginning you're clear what you're trying to do and what levels of outcomes you're interested in. I think it is pretty adaptable. So I've used it in quite a lot of different contexts now, and I think it is pretty adaptable.
Any other questions? Then I'm going to fill it up with the last question. A couple of you mentioned it's linear. Oh, Sandra, sorry. Charles. We'll come to linear, could be, because I'm actually okay with linear for a model working for a system of knowledge mobilization, not for an individual instance.
Thank you very much. These frameworks, can they also help you in understanding, demobilizing knowledge? For instance, if you want new ideas to get in, sometimes you need to make people unlearn some of the practices. I see that in Zimbabwe. Sometimes what blocks people from accepting new knowledge is old ways of doing things, which are very difficult to deal with.
This is the group discussion.
Sorry.
I think this is where it's really powerful, because for a lot of the work that I've recognised our organisation does, we don't do enough of that thinking up front. That the thinking and planning of what you're doing and what outcomes you're actually trying to achieve is the crux of it. And I think it has really helped people think through that process and say, well, what are we actually trying to do here? And we were planning to do all these things because they sound exciting and it's what everybody's doing, but do they meet, will that actually achieve the outcomes we're aiming for? So I think that's where its real power is, but trying to persuade people to invest the time up front to do that planning is quite challenging.
Okay, there is a briefing note on each table, one copy on each table. You can contact Sarah Morton to get more of them. Is that online on your website, on the CFR? And she's got some other case studies. So please thank the panelists for their work.